Finally, it's time to start talking about Gravity Falls. I finally watched the first episode of the show today, and I actually intended to live blog my reactions, but I was so enthralled by this episode that it just completely slipped my mind. I know that this show has a heavy mystery element. It's one of the few things that I actually know about the series. So I expected this episode to be the origin of the characters, how they ended up in Gravity Falls, and setting up the bigger picture more than anything, so I was surprised by how quickly it took off. We get an opening narration accompanied by some very interesting and eye-catching visuals that have some humor behind them. We get foreshadowing of the situation that our two main characters, Dipper and Mabel, are going to find themselves in by the end of the episode. And then we jump right into what I'm assuming is a standard episode of this show. There were clear elements of setup here. Dipper found the journal, for example, the one that you can buy reproductions of all over the internet, and I'm probably going to buy one myself, and starts reading it in this episode. But other than that, I would imagine that this is how the typical episode format is going to go. That some mysterious figure or event shows itself, and that Dipper tries to determine, based on information from the journal, what exactly it could be. He may or may not be right. In this case, in the case of this episode, he wasn't quite right about what he thought the thing was. And then the threat is, at least for the time being, defeated. And I was actually really impressed by how strong the mystery elements were in this episode, considering that they also had to introduce to us a bunch of characters. We meet Dipper and Mabel, and we learn quite a bit about them just from their characterization. They're both treated like kid characters, they're both written like kid characters, but they're still both characters that can be taken seriously. Dipper more so at the beginning of the episode than Mabel, with Dipper being a very serious-minded, critical thinker, and Mabel being portrayed, especially early in the episode, as the typical silly, optimistic girl. But we also get a bunch of characterization for other characters, too. Their Uncle Stan, for example, the guy who they're staying with while they're staying in Gravity Falls, and a couple of his employees, who we don't get as much of, but we still get a sense of who they are. I really found it interesting that in this town that clearly has a very odd and mysterious history of weird things occurring, their uncle is portrayed as owning a tourist shop that plays that stuff up while he himself doesn't actually believe it. Except, oh no, he actually does, because there's a reveal at the end that he's keeping secrets from the main characters, assuming that he doesn't ever make the transition over to being a third main character, I guess, rather than just a side character. Because he really was portrayed more like a side character in this episode. But no, he seems to have a secret room, so clearly he does know something about the weirdness that's going on here. And it definitely seems like that's something that's going to come to a head, and that these characters are all going to come together at some point. And I certainly hope that that's the case, and that it doesn't take too long. This show's only 2 seasons after all. I kind of want them to get to the meat of the thing as quickly as possible so we can get as much of it as we can. The main conflict from this episode came from the fact that while they're on this vacation, Mabel wants to find a boyfriend and have a sweep me off my feet summer romance kind of thing. So she's been a little boy crazy, and finally she finds a guy who's willing to go out with her, but he's very pale, he seems kind of uneven in the structure of his body, has an odd voice, is very clumsy. Oh, and she met him at a cemetery, and his hand at one point falls off and then is reattached. So, especially once he finds the journal, Dipper thinks that this guy's a zombie. So he warns Mabel to be careful of this guy. She basically dismisses his concerns out of hand. In part, I'm sure, because he warned her that her boyfriend was a zombie, which sounds ridiculous, but she still probably shouldn't have done that. And it does turn out that Dipper was right and that there was something nefarious about this guy, but he was wrong about what kind of creature the guy is. It turns out he's Keemstar. Get it? 'Cause he's a bunch of gnomes? I'll see myself out now. No, but in all seriousness, it turns out that Norman, was the guy's name, was actually a bunch of gnomes stacked on top of each other, and a representative of the somewhere around 1,000 gnomes that live in the Forest of Gravity Falls who are looking for a new queen, and they want Mabel to marry all 1,000 of them at once and then come away with them to be their queen. And she takes it very well. Good on you, Mabel, for that. When she rejects them, they then try to kidnap her, which is when they really get nefarious. Up until then, they'd just been kind of weird, but that's when they become a genuine threat to her and an actual villainous force. There's a chase and an action scene, and the gnomes are, at least for the time being, defeated. And Mabel learns the lesson that if someone shows concern for you, maybe don't dismiss that concern out of hand. While meanwhile, Dipper learns that, unlike what the journal had told him, he can trust people, primarily in this case his sister, because it turns out Mabel is incredibly capable, at least as capable as Dipper himself. It's actually her who figures out how to defeat the gnomes, which I thought was a great subversion of expectations, because I expected Dipper to be the primarily capable character and Mabel to just kind of be along for the ride. That was a very good, very well done bait and switch, and I really appreciated it. What I liked best about this 20 minutes of television is how effortlessly it balanced humor and suspense. The characters found themselves in multiple serious situations, and yet in every single one of those serious situations, the writers and animators found opportunities for comedy. The way that characters react to the situations, the way the action is animated, all of those things can be used to bring comedy into these situations and complement the suspense. This show wasn't wholly serious or wholly funny. It was a perfect balance of the two. And if it can keep that up through the entire series, I can certainly understand why so many people loved this show. At the end of the day, this was a much more complete episode of the show than I expected it to be. It wasn't nearly as much about setting everything up as I thought it was going to be. And yet it still managed to be not only a satisfying episode of the show, but a satisfying setup for the rest of the season. The animation was great, the writing was great, the humor was great, the tone was great. It was a great episode. And I am so excited to get to watch more of these going forward with these reviews. I am going to only be doing one of these a week. I do want to keep it to one a week since this was a weekly airing show when it was on the air. And I do want to try to replicate the experience of watching these live as much as possible. Obviously, I'm not going to replicate season breaks and hiatuses, but I'm not going to watch more than one episode a week either. Just wanted to let you guys know. Also, in case you couldn't tell from the rest of the video, these are going to be spoiler-filled reviews. Of course, as usual, guys, I ask, what did you think of this episode? If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below. Either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.